Okay, this is the girl's shirt with the puffed sleeve and the round collar. Very cute, very feminine, very pretty. And I've used quilting cottons, just everyday cottons. Pattern pieces you'll need the shirt front, 2 on the straight grain, back 1 on the fold, 2 puffed sleeves on the straight grain, and 2 rounded corner collars on the straight grain as well. Cutting the fabric. First of all, you need to cut out 2 fronts. So lay them on the straight grain, pin them down, and cut them out very close to the pattern edges, making sure you get those lovely curves in the hem, the waist, the armhole and the neck facing. As you cut out the front facing, you'll see where you need to cut interfacing. You don't need a special pattern piece, just use the shirt front. I'll show you later on how you can use it effectively. Once you've cut out, make sure you put all the markings in, where the facing folds over, waist marking, armhole markings, and so on. Next we're going to cut out the back, which is on the fold of the fabric. Pin it down and cut it out again close to the edge of the pattern piece, keeping those lovely curves in the hem, the side seam and the neck, etc. And again, make sure you've got all the markings, 2 notches for the back armhole. Next we're going to pin down a round collar on the straight grain, cut it out as close to the pattern as you can. We tidy it up when we're finished by folding the pattern piece in half at the centre back and making sure the curves are exactly the same. And that way we'll have a nice looking even symmetrical collar. So we do the centre back, shoulder markings folded in half, trim it up to make it look as good as possible. The next thing that we need to cut out are the sleeves. Sleeves are much bigger than the plain ones. They're very long. They get gathered up. Now there's gathering markings you need to make sure that you mark on your shirt, and the front, the back and the shoulder markings as well. It gets gathered in and looks very cute. And the angle of the sleeve helps to create a casing for the elastic in the sleeve hem. Again, looking quite cute. A very pretty shirt. So make sure you put your markings in. Okay, so now we're going to cut the facing interfacing. Just fold your interfacing over and line up with that line for where the facing gets folded over on the shirt and cut it out. Cut close to the curves of the facing and the length of the shirt. This is the iron-on interfacing. One side has got a sticky roughness to it and the other side's smooth. I usually take it out in the sunshine to find out which is the iron-on side. And once you've cut it out, cut down that centre fold there to make your nice straight front edge.
And what can happen is it can come undone, and if it's not within the stitching line, it twists in. You can end up having to re-sew an item which nobody wants to do, ever. It doesn't have to be a perfect cutting line. You can trim it up when you trim up the collar.
Shoulder seams. With the right sides facing, we're going to pin the front shoulder to the back shoulder on both sides and sew the seam from the neck to the arm opening, to the armhole seam. Have your pins pointing facing the neck, and we're going to sew this seam with straight stitch. It'll be a 2 to 3 millimetre length, and back stitch to begin and end your seam to secure it. Trim your threads, and then we're going to neaten it with zigzag, 3 millimetre length, 3 millimetre width, and again trim your seams. And we're going to press this seam towards the back of the shirt. Shirt facings. With your interfacing, you need to find the shiny side. I usually go out in the sun and turn it over both ways to find the shiny side. The other trick is to actually lay it down between the two wrong sides of your shirt facing and iron it, and it's going to stick to one side or the other, and then you know that the other one's going to sit on the opposing or opposite side. Very simple trick to figure it out. Make sure they're pressed and adhered well, and once you've ironed this, fold the facing over and make a nice crisp line. Okay, so we're up to the collar. First thing we have to do is stay stitch the neck opening of the shirt body. We're going to do this 1/2 centimetre from the edge of the fabric and sew in our longest stitch all the way around from one side to the other. Then we're going to clip it up to the seam line that we've just done with the stay stitching line. It allows the collar, when you're sewing it, to be able to fit in better. So we've got our collar, we've ironed on the interfacing as we did with the shirt facing. Put our two wrong sides of our collar together and we've pinned it in place. We're not going to pivot as sharply as we did with the sharp pointed collar, but with the rounded collar you'll get to a point where you know you're just going to have to stop, leave your needle in the fabric and lift your foot up and turn the collar fabric around just a tidbit, and you just do that all the way around. You can see my hand lifting up the foot every so often, and then you just carry on around the collar to the other corner. Take your time when it comes to the corners. Just slowly lift up the foot, move it round, do a little few stitches, move it round, another couple of stitches, move it round, and so on. On the rounded part of the collar you could do it on a much smaller stitch length, and it just means when you cut into it or cut notches out of the fabric that it won't affect it. So to cut a notch, if it's on a really tight corner or curve, you just do a little triangle of fabric and cut that out right up to the seam line. So we're just cutting into the seam, not the seam but up to it. Then we're going to trim back the collar so that when we turn it inside out there won't be too much bulk. Lots of very tiny cuts in, very closely spaced. So we're now going to grade it. So to grade it we just have our scissors on an angle, 45-degree angle, or we can just cut half of the fabric of one pattern piece halfway down towards the seam. I like the 45-degree angled grading myself, and you get quite close to that corner. And to turn this, you use your thumb to help keep that curve in, and you can use the handle part of a small pair of scissors, cotton reel. You can be quite ingenious on how to actually get that curve to sit out nicely. Never use the pointed parts of your scissors because most likely you'll pop them through. Press your fabric. I like to press on the inside first and then manually fold it down and iron it once that's done. Giving your collar a good press helps to give a good effect at the end of the day. You can top stitch your collar just like with the pointed collar, and the same as when you sewed the collar's corners, just take it carefully around the corners, lifting your sewing foot up every couple of stitches to get that nice curved look to it. You don't have to top stitch the collar. Okay, so now you have to neaten your facings. You do that with zigzag from the top of the facing to the bottom of the facing, and then we're going to pin it on. Now I'm using the same footage as I did with the pointed collar because it's exactly the same method, just a different collar. First of all, pin at the centre back, pin at the marking just before the folded facing. The collar doesn't come right up to the folded facing, it has about 1 to 2 centimetres to have that effect. Now with the rounded collar, if you're very clever, you can actually give a rounded effect to the top of the facing. So you pretty much sew your collar on, and then when you're finished with the facing and everything like that, you just do a curve where it would be quite cornered. You make a curve and you'll need to clip it and trim it to make it sit well. So with the facing, you fold it over the collar, so it's going to have right side of the facing to the right side of the shirt. And what you're doing is you're hiding that seam, so that later on when the shirt's all finished, you've got this lovely crisp seam, you can't see the seam of the collar, and it's all very tidy. As you're pinning the collar to the shirt, you can use that stay stitching seam to gather up the shirt body around the neck a little bit to fit in with the collar. Just spread out the gathering that you do and pin up as much as you can, as close as you can, so that when you're sewing up your collar, attaching your collar, it actually has a lot of attachments to it to make it not fall apart before you sew it. Right. So again, we're sewing this with straight stitch. At the beginning of the facing, you can use smaller stitches and then increase your stitches up to the 2 to 3 millimetre. As you're sewing along, take your pins out, pull the body of the shirt out of the way. Sometimes it gets tucked in and you get this little tucked in sewing bit error, which you're going to have to fix. So if you take your time, pull your fabric out, then you won't have those errors to have to fix. Once you've sewn that seam, you get to undo all that gathering and pull that gathering thread out, and again clip the collar area so that it can fit nicely to the curve, and trim the corner of the facing, tidy it up, cut your threads off, trim back that seam just a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to neaten only the parts that we're going to see. So there's not a very long space, it's about 10 to 15 centimetres depending on the garment size. So neaten that with zigzag, and then we're going to turn the facings the right way out, and it looks superb, very tidy, very professional. And to tidy it up even more, we're going to pin down that seam. So at the moment we're pressing it, but we're going to pin it down and sew it to the shirt body, and that's why it needs to be clipped so it can curve as you sew it, which will attach it to the body of the shirt and it won't lift up or get itchy for your child's neck. So we're going to pin it through first, all the way, and figure out how much the collar and facing are going to turn back as to where that stitching line will start, and put a pin there, and it'll be the same on both sides. You're going to top stitch with straight stitch, only about ½ centimetre away from the actual seam of the collar attaching itself to the shirt. Again, pull the shirt out of the way to make sure that you don't get any kinks or errors in your sewing. And when you've finished this, we're going to get the facings, the top of the facing that's not attached to the collar, and we're going to pin it onto the shoulder seam and tack that down with a few stitches. You can either do it by hand or by the sewing machine. just a couple of stitches. Armhole seams. First thing we have to do for the armhole seam is 2 lines of gathering stitch. Now with the puffed sleeve we'll have 2 lines, and they're very important because they're going to make that sleeve puffed. Once we've sewn them, tie off one set or one side of the gathering seam, so perhaps right side, and that means that you're only going to pull the threads on the left side. I pull the bobbin threads because they seem to come and gather up much quicker than the top threads. So pin your sleeve in place. This is the boy's sleeve or the plain sleeve, and once it's pinned at the side seam, the shoulder and the front or back markings, that's when we gather in the sleeve and spread it out evenly. It's a bit of a short space, it's about 10 to 15 centimetres across the whole sleeve, but it looks really nice once it's all puffed up, ready to go. So just carry on pinning the sleeve to the shirt. Use as many pins as possible. It's better to have more pins and less errors than less pins and more errors. Here's our shirt attached with all the pins, ready to sew. And we sew this with straight stitch. And we take our time because it's a curved seam, a gathered seam, and we just want to keep the body of the shirt out so we don't have those errors where they tuck in. Slowly take your time, pull the pins out as you get to them, and sew your seam from the back view. There's all our gathered part. Okay, so when you get to the end of the seam, make sure you back stitch and trim your threads because there's a lot of threads hanging around. There's 2 sets of gathering stitches that we need to now take out. And if you've knotted your pieces, sometimes you can just use your seam ripper and cut them and just pull the whole lot through at once and it's all done. So hopefully that works for you. And then we're going to clip the seam. Make sure it sits nicely once you've done that. Make your clips a bit closer in the more curved parts. And then we're going to zigzag stitch to neaten the seam. Make it nice and tidy for our shirt wearer. So pressing the seam, we're going to press the armhole seam towards the shirt sleeve. And we'll get a nice crisp look once that's finished. Side seam, we're going to pin the side seam from the lower edge to the sleeve, sewing from the lower edge to the sleeve using straight stitch. Take a bit of time over the armhole seam area because it's a bit bulkier. And remember to back stitch at the beginning and end of your seams. And then we're going to zigzag stitch that same seam. Repeat for both sides. And press it. And we're going to press the seam towards the back of the shirt. Okay, we're going to create a casing for the elastic for the puffed sleeve. So we're going to fold the sleeve edge to the wrong side, 1.5 centimetres. And we're going to leave a 2 centimetre opening on the hemline at the side seams to insert the elastic into. And you just want to measure around the upper arm of your child with the elastic for a comfortable fit and add 2 centimetres for overlapping. Trim your threads so you don't get all tangled up. And if you don't have the child, it might be a gift for someone. Just kind of think about a part of your body that might be the same size and measure around that and make it comfortable. So using your tool, it could be a safety pin or this groovy little elastic inserter that I own, and keep the end of one end of the elastic out of the opening, or else you'll just be chasing your tail. And once you get both pieces of the elastic out, then you want to sew it together. And once you've sewn it together, you can let it slide back inside the casing, pin the casing those last few centimetres, and top stitch it in place so the elastic doesn't come out, and then kind of move the elastic around in that casing so it's even and looks tidy. Here we are pinning the casing in place, and we're going to sew it down. And it's the cutest little sleeve. So we're sewing that opening down. Doesn't take very long at all. And stretch it out to make sure it all fits nicely. Lower edge hem. We're going to neaten it first with zigzag stitch from the front, one side of the front to the other side of the front, and to have a nice crisp corner on our front facing. What we're going to do is we're going to fold the facing against the pressed edge, so right side's facing, and pin it, and we're going to sew a seam 1 centimetre from that zigzagged edge. And once we've sewn that seam and trimmed our threads, we're going to cut the corner off, trim it down a bit so it's not so bulky, and when we turn it right side out you'll see a lovely crisp corner which we can tidy up with our turning tool. Okay, so we're going to pin this 1 centimetre hem, fold it over to the wrong side, and pin all the way around, a little bit less perhaps at the side seams. And then we're going to sew that with our top stitch, the same as we've done for our collar and our sleeve hem. So if you've used twin needle, you continue with a twin needle. If you've only used one stitching line, only use one stitching line. Press our hem, and we're all ready to go for fastenings, and have a look at the boy's shirt for the fastening explanation video.